Today I'm speaking with Noah Church. And Noah, you are an author and a recovery coach. I don't know, is that how you would describe yourself, a recovery coach?
Yeah, a porn recovery coach, or if I'm feeling like saying a lot of words, problematic porn use recovery coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I've been reading your book. I have it here, Wack, Addicted to Internet Porn. And I'm really impressed with it. It's very frank. You're very vulnerable in here. You really describe your own experiences and your own process. And I can imagine it must have taken a lot out of you to put something this forthcoming and vulnerable out.
I
So,
appreciate that.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
How
I
did
was,
you come to find yourself? Could you give a little bit of your background and
of
how did
course.
you come to find yourself writing a book like this?
Well, I'm 34 now, which means I was among that first generation to grow up when it was becoming common to have an internet connected computer in the home. And for me, I was probably 9 or 10 years old when I first had the idea of searching the internet for pictures of pretty women. And I found that. And I found, of course, a lot more than I was ever expecting, even back then in, close to the turn of the millennium, before anything like the streaming porn websites, before YouTube even existed, but still the internet was filled with porn if you were looking for it. And sometimes when you weren't. And that kicked off my porn addiction that I didn't realize that's what it was until many years later. But I began to seek that out whenever I had the opportunity. And of course, at 10 years old, without a computer in my own room, that wasn't all the time. And I was keeping this a secret from my family, of course. But by the time I was 12 or 13, I did have my own computer in my own room and was able to escalate my use of pornography. And looking back now, I can clearly see all the signs that it was becoming problematic. One of the major ones, one of those signs is the escalation that I was going through. And this is something we see across different addictions, or even among people who aren't addicted. They can escalate if they start drinking and maybe one beer is enough to get them buzzed, but they drink regularly and now they need harder alcohol in order to get that same feeling or more beers. And for pornography use, that escalation tends to happen with the type of content that you're seeking out. So by the time I was 13 or 14, I was consuming the most extreme forms of legal pornography, anyway, that existed out there on the internet. And a lot of it was, I can see now looking back, traumatic because of what I was seeing and the distress that it was causing me, but also because I was needing these more extreme things to get aroused because I had already become so desensitized from frequent use of this super stimulating internet pornography, the likes of which had never existed before in human history. And here I was, 12 years old, kind of the experimental subject, along with a bunch of other 12-year-olds at the time,
Mhm.
for how this sort of exposure to unlimited amounts of novel sexual content would impact a developing brain. And by the time I was 18, I had my first real relationship. I was um, thought I was in love with my girlfriend at the time. She loved me. We were excited to explore each other intimately, sexually. That had been something I'd been looking forward to my entire life. But as we started to explore that more, it felt wrong to me. It felt alien in
Mhm.
terms of my body's response to her and to our connection. And I found that I just wasn't able to maintain my arousal or my erection enough to actually have sex. And I was very confused. I felt ashamed, like something was wrong with me. And I would look for answers at that time. This was 2008. And all I would find at that time was that if it wasn't a physical problem, and I knew it wasn't because I could perform just fine for a computer screen, then it was probably just nerves and I was anxious. And I didn't think that I was particularly anxious at the beginning, but I was starting to grow more and more anxious about it as my body wasn't working the way that it should. But what I didn't realize at that time, and I wouldn't know until 6 years later, was that I had what became to be called porn induced sexual dysfunction or erectile dysfunction. And I had conditioned my brain and my sexual response system to a computer screen to the degree that that real skin on skin contact, being there with another person, was an alien experience and wasn't activating my feeling of sexual arousal, at least not to the degree that I needed it to actually enjoy sex together. And at the time with her, I was kind of desperate. I would try to imagine the things I'd seen in porn while I was with her just to try to prop up my arousal. But even that didn't really work. And I didn't have the emotional maturity or the tools to talk about it openly with her. And I didn't understand what was going on. And it just sapped the joy out of that relationship and ultimately led to the end of that relationship and to the end of all my relationships for the next 6 years until I finally learned what was really going on and committed to not using porn anymore and to healing myself.
No, it's so sad. It seems like it really derailed your opportunity to connect.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And when I did have that light bulb moment, which came to me in the form of a TED talk called The Great Porn Experiment by Gary Wilson, that allowed me to see not only what I had done to myself, but what so many other people were probably experiencing. People my age, people older than me, and certainly people younger than me who were growing up more connected to the internet than ever before. And I felt moved to do something not only about my own situation, but about the state of our society and our relationship to internet porn.
Mm.
And I felt like I needed to write the book that I needed to read when I was 16, 17, 18. And that's the book that you have in your hands now.
Did you have a sense before watching that TED talk that there was something wrong with your porn use, or did you feel like it was okay? Just was it just the amount of you mentioned escalation, so you mentioned that you
Mhm.
were watching some things that made you feel disturbed, but did you, other than that, feel that there was anything off about it or wrong with it, or were you just thinking this was normal?
I certainly felt it was normal. I heard my peers talking about it. It seemed like all the guys I knew used
Mhm.
porn, or at least most of them. And if they weren't, it was for religious reasons, not personal health reasons. And as
Mhm.
someone who wasn't religious, that didn't hold much weight for me. But it would have, I was very health conscious, and it would have held weight with me if I realized that I was harming my own sexual and emotional health with porn.
Mhm.
It did, some of the escalation disturbed me at first, but eventually I just rationalized it in my mind as it's just a fantasy. It's not real. It doesn't affect who I actually am. So it wasn't actively bothering me at the time, but it was getting in the way of being able to enjoy a vanilla sexual connection with the real partner, which
Mhm.
definitely did bother me, that I wasn't able to enjoy that and to build something like that with someone I cared about.
Mhm.
And for probably a year or more, probably more like 2 years prior to seeing that TED talk, I'd sort of checked out of dating and relationships because
Mhm.
it was too painful to go through that cycle. And I wanted to just focus on living my life and focus on other parts of life.
Mhm.
And other parts of life were going well enough that was gaining the confidence to be able to face this again and say, whatever it takes, I'm going to find out what's going on here. And that's when I searched again and found that TED talk and found the actual information I needed to fix myself. And it
Mhm.
it didn't come from, you know, doctors or therapists at the time. And even today, many of them are unaware of this relationship between chronic pornography use and these different health outcomes. But especially at the time, they wouldn't have been able to tell me what the true cause of my issues were.
Mhm.
But I was learning that from not only that talk and the website that Gary Wilson created, yourbrainonporn.com, which still exists today. And it's a great resource. But I was learning from other people who were going through the same thing I was, or who were a little ahead of me, who had already quit. And they were finding that they were able to heal. And it wasn't 1 or 2 weeks. It often took them several months, even close to a year, to fully heal. And that kind of shocked me. Back when I was in high school and in that first relationship, I thought maybe it is that I'm masturbating too much. So I would stop for a couple of weeks and we'd try again.
Mhm.
But that didn't help. And I thought, well, if a couple of weeks doesn't fix it, that must not be the issue.
Mhm.
But it was, and it just takes a lot longer for your brain to regain the sensitivity
Mhm.
that it needed to allow me to start to rewire, which is the term we use, rewire my brain to respond to new stimuli like skin on skin contact and looking in the eyes of someone I love and am attracted to, and all of that is a completely alien experience from being alone with a screen, and which is what I had been doing since I'd been 9 or 10 years old.
Mhm. I want to ask you about your recovery and about the recovery process in general. But first, as someone who doesn't watch pornography, I've seen porn a number of times, but it's never been something that I've habitually sought out or spent much time on. I always felt a very strong aversion to it, so it's not something that I've been a regular consumer of myself. But I hear people talking like you spoke about the content, the disturbing content that you were seeing,
Mhm.
and I am, as I've kind of gotten deeper into this issue and talked with more people about it, one of the things I keep hearing is that there's a lot of violence in porn. And
Yeah.
I can't validate that. I don't I that's not something I have any experience with, but do you feel like there was a lot of violent content or content where people were being hurt, or what was that like? What is the content like?
Well, anything you can imagine and much more than you can imagine is available on the internet. So the content is whatever you want to search for is probably available, especially today when you can use AI tools to create whatever your
Mm,
imagination might come up with.
mhm,
But yeah, one study found that of the top selling pornography scenes, 88% of them, I believe, contained either physical violence or verbal degradation, most like to a high degree directed towards women.
mhm,
And that was often my experience in consuming porn as well.
mhm,
And how I came to understand it is that as a collective audience, porn users were going through the same cycle that I was going through of becoming numb to more vanilla content. Like in the beginning, all I wanted to see was just pictures, still images of women by themselves, just being beautiful. But over time, I started to be exposed to, and maybe at first have an aversion to more explicit stuff. But then as I became more numb, seeking those things out because of that drive for novelty and excitement.
mhm,
And the whole porn consuming audience, I believe, goes through that same cycle. And in order to meet the demand for more and more extreme content, we start to normalize more and more extreme sex acts or depictions of
mhm,
different desires on the
mhm,
screen. And we can see the effect of that too on young people who are exploring their own sexual relationships, but not just figuring it out on their own, like fumbling around like maybe previous generations used to do, but they're emulating the things that they've seen on the screen. And what they see on the screen isn't you know loving couple enjoys morning sex together. It's you know stepsister got caught in the closet and me and the whole basketball team anally destroyed her or something like that.
wow,
Yeah.
wow,
So just all these different aspects of sexuality that introduce different emotions, and some of those emotions might not even be patently positive. It could be um, a little disgust or a little anger or a little
mhm,
fear or aversion, but any strong emotion like that actually introduces more dopamine into the reward center. And when you're already sort of aroused by being touching yourself and looking at something sexual on the screen, and then you introduce more novelty, more extreme emotions, you can spike the amount of dopamine in your reward center and overcome that hump
mm,
of tolerance that you've developed, that desensitization that you've developed from overuse, over masturbation to internet porn. And a
mhm,
lot of people become reliant on that, and then they become less and less able to just enjoy sex where two people are having a good time doing
mhm,
vanilla sexual things together.
mhm. Yeah, there was an article that came out recently that talked about the rise of choking as
Mm-hmm.
a part of sex, and that it was really shocking to see how many young people when polled, think that this is an acceptable thing. And I just can't even imagine how that ever could be related to sex in any way. But it seems to be coming from themes in pornography that kids are consuming.
Certainly. Yeah, you see choking frequently in pornography. And I'm not one to mandate like this
Mhm.
sexual act is okay and this one is immoral. As long as two consenting adults are both enthusiastically consenting, then and it's none of my business. But the problem is that it's starting before people are adults, and it's not discussed beforehand. Often a lot of women have the experience of, they never talked about it, they never asked for it, but they've just, oh, all of a sudden he's choking me
Mhm.
during sex, or
Mhm.
um, while we're making out. And that's, that sort of normalization is dangerous,
Mhm.
especially when it's an act that can cause harm
Mhm.
and even lead to death.
Well, yeah, and even staying out of the moral argument around that, it seems like evidence for the teaching tool that it provides and the way that it changes attitudes and behaviors through consumption.
Mhm. One argument that I hear sometimes from those who don't believe porn has any of these effects or isn't causing a state change in societal sexual mores is that, we can watch things like the Fast and the Furious, and it doesn't mean that we're going to be driving like that.
Mhm.
And that's true, but it's also true that ever since we were tiny children, we've seen countless examples of safe driving and healthy driving.
Mhm.
But most young people don't see countless examples of a healthy sexual relationship, or the healthy relationships that they do see, they don't actually witness the sex part of that
Mhm.
relationship. So all of their examples they've seen come from pornography,
Mhm.
and pornography is not created to teach healthy sexual relationship skills. It's created to grab your attention and hold on and keep you coming back for more, whatever it takes.
Mhm. When you were younger and you were consuming porn as a young kid, did you feel like it changed your attitude towards women?
Yeah, probably. I was fairly shy, I think, and it I think allowed me to continue staying in my shell, because
Mhm.
rather than being pushed to like put myself out there and meet more people and start to date, it allowed me just to sort of satisfy those needs with a computer screen. And of course, I wasn't really satisfied, and I would afterwards sometimes feel lonely or feel depressed, that I didn't have a real relationship, a real interaction with people my own age. But um, yeah, it definitely trained me to sexualize the women in my life, and trained me to like look at a girl or a woman and then imagine a sexual scenario like the ones I had seen in porn.
Mhm.
And yeah, sexuality had always been a part of me. And for some young people, they don't start feeling sexual attraction until puberty or later. But for me, I'd always felt it. I'd always been enchanted by women and girls. So that had always been a part of what I'd been thinking about and feeling when I
Mhm.
saw, a woman or a girl that I was attracted to.
Mhm.
But yeah, porn definitely exacerbated that and made it more explicitly sexual thoughts.
Mhm. So it inhibited your relationship seeking as well as inhibiting your physical performance within relationships once you achieve them.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and
Mhm.
it's much like, video games can give young people that, or anybody, that false sense of accomplishment and achievement
Mhm.
that can prevent them from seeking that in more meaningful ways that actually build their future or contribute to society. And yeah, video games are something I enjoyed a lot at the time too. And that plus pornography allowed me to sort of artificially meet the needs of my developing brain for achievement and connection and sexual expression. But it was all false, and it left me feeling empty. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of people ultimately feel that way.
Mhm. When you were disturbed by what you were consuming and later when you were worried about your own physical your body's own physical performance ability, did you have anybody to talk to about this, or was it something you were just going through alone?
I could have opened up to some people, like some friends or maybe my parents, but I didn't.
Mhm.
Some people in my situation might have, but I think I don't know. I just didn't have the emotional maturity or tools to talk about it, and I was sort of a prideful person who wanted to like handle everything by himself and
Mhm.
not show weakness or vulnerability. So it took me a long time to talk to anyone about it. I'd never talked to anyone about it really until after my light bulb moment, when I realized that porn was the cause of my issues. And then I told the girl that I was starting to date at the time. We'd been on, I think it was our third date when I opened up about this, and we ended up being in a relationship for about 6 months.
Mhm.
And then after that, she was very supportive, and it felt good to finally live openly and allow myself to be vulnerable and talk about this. And so I started to talk to some of my friends about it as well. And then I talked to my parents, especially after I started writing the book, and figured, well, I'm going to have to talk to my parents about this. And then, of course, as you know, started telling the whole world.
Mhm. And I can imagine your parents were probably really surprised to find out that that had been going on for you all those years.
Yes and no. I think they knew I used porn because it's hard to hide, especially when you're living with somebody else.
Mhm.
Um, I think at one point when I was young, they discovered some internet history, and my father had consumed some porn when he was younger, but of course the landscape was entirely different. He thought it was just like, yeah, you look at it, it's interesting, but then it's not as interesting as a real life relationship and real intimacy and real sex. But with the internet and the amount of unlimited, free, easy to access sexual novelty, it
Mhm.
can keep people coming back and keep people from getting to that point where they think, yeah, real relationships are uncomfortable, they take effort, but it's worth it because it's kind of boring just, masturbating to my fantasy or to these same three magazines. But with internet porn, the novelty and the amount of content can just keep you coming back over and over for years, and keep you from pushing yourself out of your shell and connecting with other human beings, which is what life is all about, right?
Mhm. No, I'm glad you brought that up because that's one of the more common things that I hear when I've been critical of porn and said that I think that it's damaging to individuals and relationships. I hear, well, porn's been around forever. Even on the cave walls, there were sexual
Mhm.
drawings. And so it seems like that's an important point to stress that it's different now.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to food, and like a lot of people struggle with eating disorders or obesity or lifestyle related diseases due to like the processed food that we have available now. And you
Mhm.
can say, well, food's been around forever and food's even good for us, so food can't be an issue. But it can. Too much of anything can be an issue,
Mhm.
or too processed, too hyper concentrated that we didn't evolve to handle. If we're constantly eating candy and other processed foods, our bodies don't handle that very well, and it
Mhm.
can lead to becoming physically ill. And too much of the hyper concentrated internet porn can lead to similar outcomes.
Mhm. Do you think that there's a safe amount of porn viewing that someone can indulge in? Is there a way to incorporate some pornography into a life and that's healthy, or is it an all or nothing thing to you?
For me personally, it's kind of all or nothing, but I don't believe it's that way for everybody. And it's less about a certain amount. Like I can't say 2 times a week is fine, but if you go above that, you're in problem territory. It's not that simple. It's really about the effects that it's having on your life. And you need to be aware of the effects that it can have before you can actually take an honest look at yourself and see if it might be having those effects. And if you're in doubt, just go without it for a month or two and see how that feels. If it's extremely difficult to go without it, or you end up going back on your promise to yourself that you'd be porn free for a month, that indicates that it might be problematic because you've lost control of your own behavior.
Mhm.
Or maybe you find that, oh, sex with my partner is feeling a lot better. Like I never got to the point where I had sexual dysfunction, but oh, actually, it was getting in the way of me fully enjoying intimacy with my partner. And maybe life is better without porn. There are different degrees of how much it can affect us. And a lot of people are in that category of it hasn't caused problems yet that are slapping me in the face and saying, like, I need to do something about this, but it can still be causing issues. And it's not just sexual issues either. It can be perhaps causing issues with your ability to concentrate,
Mhm.
your motivation or your ambition. a lot of people who do decide to quit porn, usually for those more slap you in the face reasons, like I can't have sex anymore, find that there are a lot of other benefits that they see once they quit, including being able to, like, having more energy, being able to concentrate more, having more ambition, being more engaged with their own lives, having lessened sex or social anxiety rather, and finding more joy in human connection and in other hobbies and just the little things in life, because that sensitivity that they're regaining doesn't only apply to their sexual experiences, it applies to their whole experience of life.
How, since you've been talking about this publicly and since you've written your book and you work helping other people, do you find that other people have a similar story to your own, the people that you work with? Are there elements of your story that seem like you see it over and over again, or do people have very different experiences?
There are definitely commonalities that I see over and over and over again, but there are also differences in unique situations. And one problem I see sometimes in the space is people applying their own experience universally.
Mhm.
And I've worked with enough people to know that I can't do that. And my experience can often help others, and we often share some commonalities, but I can't apply exactly what I experienced to another person who's recovering from porn use. And yeah, I've worked with many hundreds of people at this point, either one-on-one or in groups, and seen all of them, who, well, some of them are still in process, of course, but
Mhm.
I've seen all of them who were able to quit porn and give themselves enough time to recover, reverse those effects of their porn use. And that's the great news, is that these things are reversible.
Mhm.
The bad news is that if you are addicted, and the way I define addiction is that it's caught whatever you're doing, whether it's using porn or gambling or using another substance, has started to cause significant problems in your life.
Mhm.
And you've committed to either reducing your use or stopping your use entirely, and been unable to follow through with that, been unable to keep those promises to yourself for a period of 6 months or more. And you've struggled to maintain sobriety.
Mhm.
And that certainly applied to me. I did quit porn for about 8 months in the beginning. My motivation was very high, but eventually I relapsed, and I'd underestimated the strength of my own addiction and the strength of that compulsion within me. And it
Mhm.
took me more than a year in that relapse cycle off and on to really learn what I needed in order to become porn free long
Mhm.
term.
Mhm. It's many hundreds. That's a lot of people. Do you feel like how prevalent do you think this issue is?
That's a great question. I think it's very prevalent to some degree or another. Like I said, not everyone experiences the severe PIED that I did,
Mhm.
but one startling metric is the rates of erectile dysfunction experienced by younger men between 20 and 40. And before 2002, studies showed that that rate was pretty steady, around 2 to 3% experience some degree of erectile dysfunction with partners. But studies after that have shown anywhere from 15 to 33% of young men are struggling with some level of erectile dysfunction.
Wow.
And those studies don't say clearly, porn is the cause, but from everything I've seen and experienced, it's pretty clear to me that porn is the major cause of that, and
Mhm.
internet porn specifically, of course. And we know from various studies that, the majority of men at least use porn at least monthly, and a very significant minority of women do as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
And one thing I always like to mention when talking about this is that it's not just a man's problem. Women can develop addiction to porn the same way as men. They can develop sexual dysfunction with porn the same way as men. It's not as obvious because they don't need an erection for sex, but they can lose the ability to orgasm during sex. They can lose their enjoyment for real sex. And part of that can be desensitization from the porn. Part of it can be physical desensitization from overuse of vibrating sex toys.
Mhm.
And giving at least a break to both of those and allowing their sensitivity can return. It's the same or very similar process as it is for men.
Do you feel like women are more hesitant to reach out, or do you feel like there's Do you see any difference there in terms of who contacts you and how they talk about their experiences?
Yeah, certainly I have worked with women. Plenty of women have reached out to me, but I think the ratio I see is skewed. You know, I see far more men than women. And I think part of that is just because I am a man, and men are more comfortable coming to me, and women would be more comfortable coming to a woman. And there are women working in this field
Mhm.
who they can go to.
Mhm.
Not enough, but they are out there.
Mm. So what is the recovery process like? What was your recovery process like? It sounds like you started off with some dedication to change, and then you had a relapse.
Yeah, yeah. There's I can spend hours and hours talking about what the recovery process is like. So I'll try to do a quick overview of some of the things that we see commonly. One of the things that's common to addiction recovery of any kind is the period that we call the pink cloud.
Mm.
Have you heard of the pink cloud?
I think so. Will you say more
Okay.
about it?
Yeah, it's a period of time, and not everyone experiences this, but I did, in which maybe you've just started recovery and you can see clearly all the benefits that living sober has, and you're really excited about it, and you're just happy, and you're looking forward to the future, and it's really easy to stay sober because you're loving life. And that period feels great. But if you feel like, or if you believe that that period won't end, you won't be prepared for inevitably when you don't feel great,
Mm.
and the compulsion, the urges come back strong. And I definitely experienced that. I had, as I mentioned, been starting a new relationship at the beginning of my recovery. That relationship ended after 5 or 6 months, and it was a couple months after that. I'd held on, but not having that relationship anymore, feeling distress over that, feeling loneliness, definitely led into feeling those urges come back. And it was another thing that I experienced that is common is that I started to rationalize with myself, well, this doesn't count.
Mm.
It didn't go right to hardcore pornography. I would be looking at, modeling images or social media stuff, or, more soft things that society wouldn't label porn, but I was still using it in the same way to get
Mm.
myself that sexual excitement. And porn substitutes, which is what we call it. And that's a common thing for people to rationalize to themselves. Well, this isn't as bad, or this is okay. But really, they're just making it harder on themselves. They're, scratching at their chicken pox and just
Mm.
increasing the itch. And that almost always leads to a full relapse unless it's interrupted in a very intentional way, and usually with help and support from either a coach or a recovery community or a therapist. Another thing that is more unique to porn recovery is what we've come to call the flat line. And again,
Mm.
not everyone experiences this. Some people experience it once, some people experience it many times, but it's a period of time. Um, Usually I wait for it to last for at least 10 days before calling it this, but it's a period of time in which you feel like your sexuality is gone, like your
Mm.
libido and your sex drive is gone. Maybe your genitals even feel like numb or smaller.
Mhm.
And it can also come along with other symptoms that are withdrawal symptoms, irritability, tiredness, insomnia, mood swings, things like this that can be very distressing when you feel like, and you're not prepared for, you're not educated about the flat line, and you feel like your sexuality is just gone and you're wondering if it will ever come back. And that can lead to people relapsing because they're desperate to feel something again. So they go
Mhm.
back to porn and see if they can still feel arousal. But that's, of course, the opposite of what you really want to do. What you want to do is allow that period to happen.
Mhm.
And how I've come to understand it is it's your body taking advantage of finally not being hyperstimulated by sexual content to sort of shut everything down and do some repair work and do some
Mm.
healing. And most often that flat line ends in its own time, and you can feel your libido coming back after usually 1 to 6 months. And
It
yeah,
must be a
it can
scary
take a long
thing
time.
for some
Mhm.
people to experience that.
Especially if they haven't been educated about it and seen that,
Mhm.
okay, a lot of other people have gone through this, it's temporary. Phew. But if they don't know that, then it can feel very frightening.
Mhm. Mhm. So there's the pink cloud when everything seems easy and you can just see all the benefits, and it sounds like kind of an infatuation period, like, oh, I
Yeah.
can just, this is no problem. I'm going to live life to the fullest. And then there's a setback, it sounds like, and then that's when the temptation really occurs, because I can imagine for a lot of people, they've turned to porn and self-stimulation as stress relief and as a comforting routine rhythm in their lives. So when that tool is removed, well, then they've got to create new coping mechanisms.
Yeah, you spot on. Every addict I've ever worked with did exactly that. And it becomes no longer just about sexual expression or I feel horny, so I'm going to use. It becomes an emotional tool or coping mechanism for other feelings as well, whether it's boredom or loneliness or stress. It's stimulating enough that it can wipe any of those emotions out of your mind, at least for the moment while you're using. And of course, afterwards, those emotions can come back even harder, especially if maybe you were feeling stress because you hadn't done your school assignment. So you used porn for an hour to make yourself feel better. But now, afterwards, the reality that, oh, I've wasted another hour and now I have to stay up all night working on my school assignment, that reality comes back. So the stress is even worse. But porn use is a real solution to real problems. And that's why it becomes compulsive, because it works. You can wipe out those emotions. You can, time travel, 3 hours can go by like they're nothing. It really works. But eventually for a lot of us, it starts causing more problems than it's solving.
Well, it must be incredibly difficult during that period of temptation to not cave, because unlike a lot of other things that one might be addicted to, even alcohol, you'd have to take a trip to the store. And so there might be a moment there where there's many moments there where you could catch yourself and talk yourself back out of it. But with pornography, it's just in your phone. It's right there.
Yeah, that easy access is exactly the most challenging part of recovery. And, if we all had like a cocaine dispenser in our homes that just dispensed unlimited cocaine, we'd have a lot more people addicted to cocaine. But we don't. It's expensive and sometimes difficult or legally risky to acquire, which keeps the level of people using it and addicted to it down. But that's not the case with porn. And another risk factor for developing addiction or other issues is the age of first exposure. And of course, the age of first exposure to porn is a lot lower than with hard substances like that. The average age in one study was 11, and that tracks. For me, it was 9 or 10. For the people I work with, a lot of them, it was when they were quite young, 8 to 14 years old. Some people even younger, 5 or 6. You can certainly develop all the same problems even if you didn't use porn until you were an adult, but the risk factor goes up a lot the younger you were exposed to it, the younger you started using.
I do want to also ask you about that, but going back to recovery, after the flatline, is there an immediate improvement that people start to see, or is it more of a gradual process? And does everybody experience the flatline?
Not everyone experiences the flatline. I didn't experience one until my first relapse, and then I went into a flatline for a month. So yeah, it's unpredictable. For some people, it happens as soon as they quit. Some people don't experience it for quite a while. Some people never do. Some people have multiple flatlines. Some people have one flatline that lasts a year and then it's over.
A year.
Yeah, it can be a year or more in some cases. And that, as you can imagine, is pretty frightening. But yeah, I'd say the pattern that most characterizes recovery isn't gradual or sudden. It's a roller coaster. It's ups and downs. For a day or a week, maybe you feel great. Maybe you feel like you're fully healed. And then the next day or week or month, you feel terrible, or you're back in a flat line, or you're struggling with urges every day. But if you zoom out far enough, as long as you are sticking to that protocol of being porn free and not cheating yourself by using porn substitutes, people see a gradual improvement in whatever they're trying to improve on. And that includes urges. And the topic of what to do about urges and how to handle them is a huge one. But I can say simply that it does get better over time. It does get better. The time period in which you're free from urges, free from even having to think about it very much, those get more common and longer. But one reality that I've come to accept for myself, and I do try to encourage my clients to accept, is that if you have been addicted that addiction will always be a part of you. And that doesn't mean it has to control you. It doesn't mean you're doomed to relapse, but it does mean that even though that part of you might be dormant, if you're not aware of the dangers, if you crack open that door again and start looking at porn substitutes or whatever it might be, you can quickly bring that beast back to the surface and fall right back into the same patterns. So that's why I said earlier, for me, it is all or nothing. Like I can't have a moderate, healthy use of porn. If I open that door, I just bring it all back, bring back all the problems, including the sexual dysfunction, which is easier to bring back a second time than it is to develop the first time. But for others, I know that it's possible to use porn in moderation. It doesn't become out of control. It might not cause significant problems in their lives, but even those people, I would encourage, hey, go for a month or two without it. If porn isn't a problem, then going without it for a month or two won't be a problem, and you might learn something about yourself.
Well, it must be difficult also, as we were talking about the ease of access, there's also just, even as somebody who doesn't search for porn, I see sexually explicit things, just like there's porn bots on Twitter. And if I'm getting them and I'm a woman, I can only imagine how much more prevalent they are in the timelines of male internet users. So you've got all these things. Do these tend to trigger relapses in people, or how do you stay strong once you've decided, okay, I'm done with this, and then you're being bombarded by images in society?
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties. And especially if you have been using social media, the algorithms learn what you engage with. And so if you're engaging with sexual content, it's going to keep feeding you more and more sexual content. Even after you've decided, hey, I'm done. Twitter, Instagram, I'm done. Stop doing this. It'll keep feeding you that until you actually have to go through and say, not interested, don't show me more like this. And if you're diligent enough, you can change what type of content you're being fed. But other people can just decide, hey, I don't need Instagram in my life, and they'll delete it. Part of that, cleaning up your environment is part of recovery, so that you can feel safer on your own devices, safer in your own home. There's some software that you can use to either block content or encourage more accountability in your life. Like there's software you can install on your devices, and then I can ask my partner or my friend or my recovery group to hold me accountable, and then they will be alerted if I'm looking at sexual content on my devices. And so that knowledge that what I look at isn't totally private can take a lot of the hot air out of an urge, knowing that this, I'll have to talk about this later with whoever I invited to hold me accountable, can help a lot. But also, there's no completely avoiding those triggering images. Watching TV, driving down the street, you see a billboard, even just people, especially in the warmer months, can be triggering if you're used to sexualizing the image of people. And you have to learn how to cope with that and how to not be pushed off balance by that. And a big part of that, as you referred to before, is learning other ways, healthier ways of coping with your own emotions, of finding your center again, of calming yourself down, of meeting your real emotional needs rather than running from them or distracting yourself from them.
You said that the people that have gone through this that you've known a lot of people who are successfully able to rid themselves of this particular addiction.
Well, again, I wouldn't say that. I'd say they're still addicts, but they're not actively engaged with their addiction, and they're living great lives, and they're not held back by their addiction. And I can maybe this is self-delusional, but it's a productive self-delusion of seeing it even as a blessing, because it forces me to live my best life consistently and to maintain healthy habits, because I know how far I have to fall if I don't. Like if I stop going to bed and getting enough sleep, or if I start binge watching media content that's non-sexual, maybe for someone who never had a screen-based addiction, that's not a big deal. But for me, I know from my past relapse experiences, all that makes it much more likely to relapse with porn. And that's something with a lot of heavy consequences for me. So it kind of forces me to keep on the path that's truly best for me.
You mentioned screen-based addiction. I saw a statistic sometime not that long ago that said 25% of adults are addicted to their smartphones. And my
Mm.
thought was, well, that sounds really low. I would have thought it'd be higher than that.
Yeah. Well, at least the definition of addiction that I work under, you can't say that you're addicted until you try to quit, until you try to stop or reduce your use. And I would wager that most people who would discover they are addicted to their cell phones haven't tried to stop using them yet, or to control their use in a healthy way. And truly, like, I love technology. Technology is fascinating to me. It's a field that I do some work in. But if you don't use tech in an intentional way, the people who designed technology and software are going to end up using you.
You talked about the age of first exposure as a factor, and also the average age of first exposure being about 11 years old. How do you recommend parents prepare their kids for a world where they're going to find this kind of content?
It's a great question. Number one, get used to talking about it. My own parents didn't talk about sex very much at all, and I talked to my father about it later, as an adult, and he said, well, my parents sort of just let me figure things out for myself. So I took the same approach with you, not realizing that I wasn't figuring it out for myself. I was learning a lot of toxic lessons from pornography. And that's something that parents have to accept, is that if I don't directly address this and teach my son or daughter the sexual values that I believe they should have, and teach them about the dangers out there, they're going to be completely vulnerable to those dangers. And it's not going to happen when they're 18. It's going to happen when they're 11, or younger. And there are a couple of books out there that can help you start having that conversation. There's Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, which is, a children's book meant to be read with your children. And it can start that conversation early at an age appropriate way. You're not necessarily talking about porn-induced sexual dysfunction or extreme, pornography when they're young, but you're just talking very simply about, some media content, some pictures you might see on a screen can be hazardous for you and can be bad for your health. And if you see something that you're questioning, like, come talk to me about it, and just encouraging them to be able to talk to you and to ask questions and to not feel like there's a wall there. And my own parents never intentionally built the wall, but I guess I was intuitive enough to sense that there was discomfort around the topic of sexuality. So I just decided never to talk about it with my parents.
Yeah. I can imagine a lot of families feel that way. And what resources do you recommend to people who are struggling with porn use, and your own resources that you offer, as well as others that you think would be helpful?
Well, the site that started it all for me is still a great resource, yourbrainonporn.com. It collects all of the relevant scientific research, as well as many testimonies of people who experience these things. And it's a great place to start. My own book, I wrote it as a starting place as well. And it's available now for free. You can sign up to my email newsletter and you can get the PDF for free in your inbox. I've made online courses as well, comprehensive video courses. On one of them is about how to recover from any form of porn-induced sexual dysfunction, which can be erectile dysfunction. It can be sexual performance anxiety. It can be delayed ejaculation, premature ejaculation. All of these things can be porn related. And another course that's really my magnum opus in this field, that is meant to take like 4 to 6 months for someone to complete, that takes people through every step of building a sustainably porn-free life. So there are those resources of mine, but if you don't resonate with me or the way I teach, there's other resources out there as well. Pornhelp.org also has links to different resources, including Porn Addicts Anonymous, a 12-step group meant for people who are recovering from porn addiction, and resources to find a therapist who's a certified sex addiction therapist as well, who has more training to help you overcome sexually related addictions. And I do believe that for most people, especially those who have addictions to porn, it's not just one thing that's going to be the key to stopping that. Like, it's a holistic process, and the process of recovering from an addiction forces you to change pretty much everything about your life. And it's like going through a second puberty. You know, it can be
Mm.
very uncomfortable. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of habits you need to change. But it's ultimately one of the most rewarding experiences, because the process of learning how to be addiction free is the process of learning how to be a mature and healthy adult.
I will include some links to those resources that you just described in the description of this video. And where can people find you if they want to read more of your writing or look into your services?
I'll give you my link tree, which you can put down in the description. It contains all the links. But addicted-to-internetporn.com is my website.
It's nice and straightforward.
Yeah.
Is there anything that we didn't cover in this conversation that you think would be important to talk about before we conclude?
Usually my answer to that question is addressing that this is not just a men's issue, but a women's issue. But we already talked about that. I think we've covered all the basics. And for those who listen to this and know, hey, this is something that might directly relate to my life or the life of someone I know, we've given them enough to now go on their own fact-finding adventure and learn more. But that's one more thing I'll mention before we end, is that even if porn isn't a problem for you, you know people for whom it's a problem. And they might not even know it's a problem for them, but we all know people who are struggling with this to some degree or another. We just don't recognize that because we don't talk about it. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about porn use. We don't talk about our fears about how that might be affecting us. And that's something I would like us to start to change as a society, is to talk about it more.
Talk about it more openly with each
Yeah.
other. Yeah. Well, that's great advice. And I really appreciate your perspective and your health-based approach to this issue that's affecting a lot of people.
Yeah. Thanks for the limelight and for exposing your audience to this. I know I'm not the first person you've talked to about porn problems. So
No,
I'm
I've
sure
talked
you're.
with a couple, and I'm
Mm.
really impressed with the men that are coming out and talking about this. And I agree with you. I think it's something that people are quiet about and don't talk about enough. And I've seen enough and talked with enough people to see that this is a really big silent problem. So I'm glad you're out there and people like you are out there having these conversations and offering connection and support and resources.
Appreciate you, Leslie.
Yeah, thank you, Noah.